Hello YouTube. As many of you know, Skyrim and Oblivion are among my favorite games of all time, but one thing that's curious about these games is that while Skyrim, being the Elder Scrolls V, is officially a sequel to Oblivion, the Elder Scrolls IV, the two games have very little to do with one another and are set in completely different time frames, as Skyrim is set a little over 200 years after the events of Oblivion. But what many people forget is that back in 2009 and in 2011, Bethesda actually did release some material to sort of bridge the gap. Specifically, they released these two novels, Infernal City and Lord of Souls. And these novels, oh boy, they are kinda awesome. While literary wise they are nothing special and they definitely have their bad parts, they introduced some concepts to Tamriel's lore long before Skyrim did so, as the first of these two novels released in 2009. For example, back in 2009 we were already introduced to the Thalmor in this novel, we were introduced to the Mede Emperors and to the Penitus Oculatus. It also gave us an insight into what happened to the Empire after the Oblivion Crisis long before Skyrim's lore books did. These novels, they're kinda little miracles for existing, as I personally kinda hope that they would open the floodgates for more Elder Scrolls novels, as there's so much potential in it for telling character-driven stories on Tamriel. But alas, it was not to be, and these two novels, set in the year 48 of the Fourth Era, remain to be the only novels to be ever released officially as part of the Elder Scrolls universe. Now, in this video I want to give you a summary and some lore analysis of these books. The video isn't really a review of the books, but if I had to review them, I would say that they are decent. Definitely some slow sections, but mostly worth a read for an Elder Scrolls fan, especially if you read them in a historical context of the first book releasing in 2009, years before Skyrim, while already introducing us to some of the Fourth Era's coolest lore concepts. So it's definitely worth a read or a listen, as the audiobooks are quite alright, especially since they're dirt cheap nowadays, so turn the video off now if you want to read them spoiler free. Alright, long setup to the video done, let's talk about the story of the novels after the intro. Alright, so Infernal City and Lord of Souls by Greg Keyes. Both novels tell a single story, with Infernal City telling the first half of the story and Lord of Souls being a direct sequel, telling the story's conclusion. The story is told from several different points of view, as we have a pretty diverse cast of main characters, who, by the way, we all don't have official art for, so the art that you'll see in this video is kind of just there to represent them with old Elder Scrolls Legends artwork, because if there's one thing that was really amazing about that now defunct game, it was the artwork. But keep in mind that this is not official art representing them, it's official art from a different game. Alright, so the main cast of characters. First there's the young Breton girl Anaïk Hoynard and her best friend, the Argonian Mir Glim, who start out together in the story but later on get separated a bit. We also have the second set of protagonists, the old Dunmer warrior Sul, who has a mysterious past, and then the crown prince of the Mede Empire, Atrebus Mede, who despite the wishes of his father, Emperor Titus Mede I, got involved in the story trying to play the hero essentially, but we'll get there when we get there, as we have two other protagonists to introduce to you. The fifth protagonist is a guy named Colin, who is a recently graduated inspector for the Penitus Oculatus, the Empire's security service, a bit like a CIA or KGB. I covered their entire shtick in my video on them, so watch that video for more information, as a lot of their original information and conception came from these books, and then later Skyrim brought them into the games. A link to that video on the Penitus Oculatus is in the description. Anyway, Colin will be our fifth protagonist, who is looking for Prince Atrebus after the prince tried to play the hero and kinda screwed up and then disappeared. And finally we have our sixth and final protagonist, who only appears in the second book, Masgar Gra Yagash, an orc member of the Imperial Legion, through whom we kinda see the effect of the story on the Empire and the Empire's attempts to deal with it. Alright, protagonists covered, let's talk about the story. Now, I decided that instead of telling you the story like it happens in the book, with plot twists and the like intact, I will instead tell you the story chronologically, so starting with the events in the past, which you only uncover during the latter parts of the books. I think that way I can convey the contents of the books most clearly and also tell you the most about the lore and have you understand their stories better than if I went then they go there, then they go there, then they learn this, which happened 10 years ago. That kind of makes for a terrible viewing and listening experience, I think, and if you want that experience, well, the books are right there in both physical and digital and audiobook format, so go for that if you want to hear the story as it's intended. But I'm basically doing a lore analysis and summary here. Alright, now the background to the story begins in the late 3rd, early 4th era Morrowind in Vivec City, where the living god Vivec mysteriously disappeared after losing much of his power and prestige after the events of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Dunmer society at the time was changing and there was much uncertainty about the future. Now, most Morrowind fans at this point will realize that if Vivec is gone and his power is gone as well, there's a teeny tiny little problem in the shape of a gigantic rock called the Bar Dao, or Ministry of Truth, floating above Vivec City, which had once been hurled at the city in an attempt to destroy it in times past, but was stopped from destroying the city and held up in the sky by Vivec using his powers, to show the Dunmer people his power, and also a little bit of a warning to show that if his followers ever stopped worshipping him, he could literally drop a rock, like this meteor like a rock, on the city anyway. Now, without Vivec, there was a serious risk of this rock, which had been converted into the Flying Ministry of Truth, falling on the city and completely wiping it out. So the Dunmer sought for a solution, and eventually they found one, as some of the cleverest Dunmer minds at the time developed a machine called the Ingenium, which could convert mortal souls into power, and could then use that power in order to keep the Ministry of Truth afloat above the city. In fact, what the machine actually did was take mortal souls and then use those mortal souls to open a pathway or soul tunnel to the Daedric plane of existence of the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile, Daedric prince of bargains, and then using the opening to his plane to siphon off some of Clavicus Vile's own power and then using it to keep the ministry afloat, using his Daedric power. And Clavicus Vile at the time either did not notice this siphoning off of his power or was so happy with the flow of fresh souls into his realm that he was more than fine with the bargain. Now, the thing is though, this Ingenium, while effective, required many souls to be powered, and in fact required a constant supplies of new souls. At first they simply sacrificed both prisoners and slaves to the machine, killing them for their souls and feeding them to the Ingenium. But there are only so many of those, and they started to quickly run out. And then a new method was found. One of the designers of the Ingenium, a man named Vuhon, found a way to slowly siphon off the soul out of a living person, specifically a living person with a soul of a certain size, specifically a pretty rare big size. That person would eventually perish, but from what we learn in the books, the Ingenium burned through these people far less quickly, and it was far more stable and durable this way to keep the Ministry of Truth or the Bar Dao afloat above the city. But as you can probably guess, this whole sacrifice thing, it didn't really sit right with the people who were sacrificed and their families, and in the end, it was a pretty cruel system of sacrificing the few for the many, even if they would sacrifice themselves willingly, which most of them didn't do, as most of them were forced to sacrifice themselves. This kinda came to a breaking point when the designer Vuon picked the wife of another person who had helped design the Ingenium, Sul, to power the ministry. Sul's wife, Iljeven, her soul was the right quality, and thus he chose her to power the Ingenium next, against her will and without Sul's knowledge, meaning that Sul flew in a rage when he discovered that she had been picked and that her soul was being siphoned off to keep the Bar Dao afloat. Now, a little side note here, Vuhon says that Sul was just being egotistical and putting his own needs before that of the population of Morrowind, because other sacrifices also didn't go willingly, but they didn't have the benefit of someone being on the design team to protest their sacrifice. Meanwhile, Sul claims that she was picked by Vuhon because she had rejected him and chose to love Sul instead. We may never really know the truth of that statement, but what we do know is that Sul came into the ministry Rambo style and just went all in on freeing his wife Iljeven, trying to free her from the Ingenium. But Vuhon resisted this rescue attempt and he fought Sul in the Ingenium chamber, trying to keep her there and trying to prevent him from freeing her. Ultimately, their fighting destroyed the Ingenium in a big explosion, and the Ministry of Truth, the big rock, the Bar Dao, plummeted into Vivec City, destroying the entire city and leaving a gigantic crater called the Scathing Bay in the place where the city had once been, and also creating shockwaves which caused for tsunamis across Tamriel as far as the Somerset Isles, and creating earth tremors which would eventually cause Red Mountain to erupt, destroying much of Morrowind, which then weakened the Dark Elf society so much that the Argonians then invaded and destroyed even more of Morrowind. While I am against blood or soul sacrifices of any kind, I do have to say Sul did end up trying to free his wife, not just to the detriment of Vivec City, but when looking at the aftermath, to the detriment of all of Morrowind. But still, I don't know, man, in his position I might have made the same choice if it was my partner. Sorry, not sorry. Anyway, time to get back on track, because you see, while Ilsheven and everyone else in the Ministry died upon impact, the explosion of the Ingenium actually sucked both Sul and Vuhon into the soul pipeline to Clavicus Val's realm, meaning that the two of them got stuck in oblivion, while at the same time, while they were passing through the soul pipeline, they could see a sword being thrown from Val's realm through the soul pipeline towards Tamriel, passing them as they were sucked in. And once they landed, there was no time to continue fighting each other, as a strange and dark Daedric being awaited them on the other side, a spirit in the shape of a man but with eyes like holes into nothing. This was the spirit Umbra, which once possessed the sword by the same name, which can drive people mad by using it. Now, Clavicus Val, who had commissioned the sword's creation for causing mischief on Tamriel, had imbued it with part of his power. However, he was tricked during the creation of the sword, and part of his power that he had given away to the sword Umbra became an independent spirit by the same name, so an independent spirit named Umbra. But for that whole story, be sure to watch my video on the sword Umbra. It's actually a pretty interesting story and it's in the description. But what's important to know here is that within Clavicus Val's realm, Umbra was able to escape the sword, and he was hunted down by Clavicus Val, who wanted to, understandably, put him back in the sword so he could better control this stolen bit of his own power. However, Umbra had ran away to the fringes of Clavicus Val's realm, where he could not find him. And he then came upon the Tunnel of Souls to the Mortal Plane, to the Ministry of Truth. And Umbra then figured that at one point the Soul Tunnel should become wide enough to throw the sword Umbra through, so that the sword could be lost on Tamriel, while Clavicus Val could then no longer put him back in, as the sword would be outside of Val's reach. This moment presented itself when the Ingenium exploded, and so the sword was thrown through the Soul Tunnel as Sul and Vuhon were being sucked in. Now, when they landed, the spirit Umbra took them captive, and what exactly Umbra wanted to do with them is unknown, but Vuhon, begging for his life, offered Umbra a way of escaping Clavicus Val's realm. Specifically, he told Umbra that he could build an Ingenium with the power of Umbra and Vuhon's own soul, and together with a bunch of other souls, they could use this new Ingenium to take a piece of Clavicus Val's Oblivion realm and tear it away from the Daedric Prince's control, allowing them to escape the realm with that little piece of metaphysical land and eventually go to the Mortal Plane with it and set both of them free. Umbra accepted this proposal, and Vuhon then started working on this new Ingenium, while Sul was thrown into a torture chamber. Now, both Vuhon and Umbra were so busy with creating this Ingenium, which would allow them to escape, that neither of them noticed that Sul managed to escape the realm of Clavicus Val on his own, using his own magics, which led him through several other Daedric realms before getting back to Tamriel, where he went out to see what had become of his homeland, which obviously was completely destroyed by this point. Now, this all took place somewhere between the year 3 and 5 of the 4th era, while the books take place over 43 years later in the year 48 of the 4th era. And during that time it seems that Sul lived through most of Morrowind's catastrophes, from the Red Mountain eruption to the Argonian invasion, and he swore revenge on Vuhon after seeing the immense devastation, as he blamed Vuhon for everything, as in his words, if Vuhon had let him free his wife and placed someone else in the Ingenium, it all would not have needed to happen. And I mean, again, I kinda likely would have done the same thing if it was my partner, so I get him, but it was also kinda his fault, let's be honest here. Anyway, during those 40 years between the background events and the books, Vuhon worked on the second Ingenium and eventually managed to finish it. He and Umbra then chose an area of Clavicus Val's realm which was a sort of city filled with intelligent trees, which may or may not be cousins of Blackmarsh Hist trees, as they are very similar in their powers, and they put the new Ingenium right over there by the trees and by the city. Umbra and Vuhon then fused their souls together, putting their soul in the Ingenium, not in a way which would consume their soul, but rather so that they could take full control over the Ingenium and the land around it. They then used the powers of this new Ingenium to wrest the city-like place from Clavicus Val's realm and escape this realm with it. This piece of rock with a city on it became the floating city of Umbriel, and using the power of the Ingenium, it was able to move freely among the planes of Oblivion, from the Prince Planes to smaller demi-planes. It presumably did this through the power of the semi-histories, and at the same time that power was controlled by the Ingenium, as the Ingenium allowed them to control the histories on the island. I keep saying histories, but it's more like pseudo-histories, since they do seem to be a little bit different. Now, the interesting thing here is that while they were definitely out of Clavicus Val's reach, they did not truly leave Clavicus Val's realm, because actually the floating city was at all times surrounded by a sort of bubble, which in essence was just a piece of the realm of Clavicus Val, which they had ripped from his grasp. This made it so that Vuhon and Umbra, who fused together and had started calling themselves Lord Umbriel as a singular being, they were not even able to leave the floating island, and neither were the other inhabitants of the city, as while they traveled the plains, the city itself also developed a lot of interesting life and inhabitants over whom the fused Lord Umbriel now ruled. In fact, the whole society, which was powered and fueled all by the Ingenium, became a bit of a caste system where you had higher lords and ladies and lower lords and ladies, you had workers and a sort of lower caste workers called the Scraws, who collect the food and materials provided to the city by the Ingenium, as the Ingenium provides the city with all its food and also with new inhabitants, as new inhabitants of the city grow from the Ingenium. The city's society became pretty diverse, however the existence there was pretty boring, and as such the higher and lower lords and ladies mostly just did nothing all day except for eat, which caused for a rich and diverse food culture which was extremely competitive, as kitchens who worked for lords often got fought over if they were able to make good stuff. Oh, and they also eat souls, the higher lords that is, and they have extremely strange tastes, which I mean is pretty logical if your only hobby after 30 years of floating around is just food. Now, what's interesting here is that their travels through the plains were mainly aimed at giving Lord Umbriel a way to escape the city, as he wanted to be truly free, but nowhere they could find a method to truly escape Clavicus Val's realm, and they could not go to the mortal plane as Martin's sacrifice had made that impossible, unless they were summoned using a specific ritual which circumvented the new protections. And the mortal plane was the place where they really wanted to go, as there were a lot of souls for them to siphon off into the Ingenium, which they still needed to control it, and b, you had the metaphysical towers there, like the White Gold Tower, which Vuhon theorized could be used in a ritual to free their little Oblivion bubble from Clavicus Val's control. That's very interesting, but unfortunately they had no way to get to the mortal plane at that point. And before you ask, the mechanism is never truly explained on how they intended to use the towers to do that, but apparently that was something that was possible. However, it wasn't all possible for them, as they weren't able to get to the mortal plane. That is, until one fateful day when the pseudo-histories on Umbriel managed to make contact somehow with some of the histories back in Blackmarsh. And the call between these two histories in Blackmarsh and the histories or the pseudo-histories on Umbriel seems to have gone a little bit something like this. Hello, Blackmarsh History here. Yeah, hi, this is your cousin from Umbriel who's being controlled by Dark Spirit Umbra and a Dunmer. We kinda wanna get to the mortal plane. Can you help out? There are souls there that we need. Souls, you say? This sounds dangerous. What will happen if we summon you here? Well, we would basically suck up the souls from anyone who gets close to the city, especially at the place where we are summoned, and kill all those mortals and make them into undead armies to guard us. You know, even the Argonians. Sounds good? Yeah, no. Talk to you later, cousin. Bye. Sorry about that, but that's about how it went. However, unfortunately for everyone, there was one history, specifically the Lilmoth history, which had cut itself off from the rest of the histories, and this specific history had kinda radical ideas. Specifically, it conspired with the nationalistic government of Blackmarsh, the Ansalil, to get all non-Argonians and Argonians who weren't Argonian enough and had taken traits from other races and cultures out of Blackmarsh. And when that history heard of Umbriel, it was kinda like, don't mind if I do. If we warn our good Argonians to get out of the area before we summon Umbriel, we can make sure that Umbriel just destroys all the Outlanders and Luquil, or assimilated Argonians as they call bad Argonians. and we just don't have to do it because they'll do it for us. What a great plan. So that history then contacted Umbriel on its own, and with the Ancellil it forged a plan. They would call the city to the mortal plane so that it could kill all non-Argonians and the assimilated Argonians for them. Meanwhile, Lord Umbriel used this connection to communicate with the Argonian Ancellil government and had them invite the leader of the Elder Council of the Empire and Prime Minister to the then reigning Emperor Titus Mede I to Blackmarsh under the guise of a political summit. While in truth, the High Chancellor and Prime Minister, a man named Hirem, then used this meeting to communicate with Lord Umbriel and negotiate with him instead of negotiate with the Ancellil on behalf of the Empire. They negotiated that Hirem would make sure that the White Gold Tower would be ready for the ritual which would free Umbriel. And in return, Lord Umbriel would use his immense and partly Daedric powers in order to overthrow Titus Mede and make Hirem the new emperor. A pretty clever plot, however no one involved truly trusted each other, as it seems that Lord Umbriel had no real intention of holding up his part of the deal and make Hirem emperor. And Hirem had no real intention of making the White Gold Tower ready for them, and he instead used this farce of an agreement to lure Umbriel to the tower so that he could use the tower's power to steal all the soul power in Umbriel to make himself a god on the level of Tiber Septim, and then depose Titus Mede and rule Tamriel as a god. A lot of double crossing going on here, but this is, believe it or not, where the novels truly start, because all of this previous information you learn over the course of the story in tiny little tidbits, while for this lore video I found it more convenient to give you the information chronologically. Although the whole thing about the Hist call, we don't know exactly how that went, that was just my interpretation, obviously, but I found it funny. Now, upon Hirem's agreement, he and the Ancellil and the Lilmoth history complete the ritual to summon Umbriel to the mortal plane, and so it happens that Umbriel in the year 48 of the 4th era entered the mortal plane, floating into Tamriel several hundreds of miles south of Blackmarsh, above the oceans. And from there it slowly but surely started flying northwards, towards Blackmarsh. It's here where the first few chapters of the first book take place, where we follow Anaig the Breton and Mirglim the Argonian in a bit of their daily life in the city of Lilmoth. Here we learn of Argonian culture and we see that Anaig is an aspiring alchemist. And over the course of these first couple of pages we see how Anaig and Mirglim learn of the floating island that kills anyone in its wake from the south. Some sailors claim to have seen it and have reported it slowly going northward towards them. Rumors then start spreading throughout the city, and even a member of the Sigic Order is spotted in the city who is investigating the rumors of this strange magical anomaly. Now, Anaig's father, who works as an advisor to the Ancellil government, also heard the rumors and he tried to get her away from the city in time by forcibly putting her on a ship to go live with her family in Cyrodiil. But Anaig, with the help of Mirglim, escapes the ship, and then from a distance they see how the city Umbriel literally steals the souls of everyone in the city below it and kills them. In horror they watch, but they then decide to drink a levitation potion that Anaig had been working on to try and get up to the city and then destroy it somehow. But of course, things are never so easy. In fact, once they land in the city, they are quickly found by some of the lowest worker class, who quickly sell them out to someone of higher standing in the city in order to get some scraps. Now, luckily for them, the person who they were sold to was a head chef of one of the kitchens, and instead of killing them or reporting them to Lord Umbriel, she puts them to work, thinking that someone from the surface could probably cook something extra amazing with their knowledge, and thus that she could probably use them to get ahead of the other kitchens in this very competitive cooking scene on the island, because again, most lords and ladies were all pretty bored all the time and have just eating as their hobbies. Now, these parts of the book, where you are in the kitchens, can be pretty damn slow, and unfortunately they are my least favorite passages, as the rest of the book is actually quite good in my opinion. But quickly summarized, Mirglim sucks at cooking, so he's quickly sent to work with the Skrulls, the lowest workers, while Anaig uses her alchemical talents to make dishes never before seen on Umbriel. This means that over the course of the story, she becomes pretty famous in Umbriel, and several different kitchens literally fight over the right to have her work for them, sometimes straight up murdering everyone in a kitchen. It's a story filled with backstabbing, betrayal and a lot of food talk, which has her moving up to the upper echelons of the city, where she eventually has to cook for Vuhon and Umbra in the form of Lord Umbriel themselves. But what none of the people she works or cooks for know is that she has a little secret. You see, she has a likely Dwemer-made little contraption, which, I'll be honest, we haven't heard of in the lore existing before, and haven't heard of it since. But this little contraption, called Ku, is a small metal bird connected to a locket, and by instructing the little bird to fly someone, that person can then use this magical little metal bird to talk to the person with the locket, kind of video call style. It feels a little forced as a plot device, but it does what it needs to do, as at the start of the story, Anaik uses Ku to contact our third protagonist, Prince Atrebus Mead, Crown Prince of the Empire, who is a bit of a nationwide hero, as he personally fought in many important battles, with him and his companions attaining the status of legends across the Empire, with many books and pamphlets across the land telling of his abilities and valor. Anaik has heard of this all too, and so when there's a Tamriel-wide threat, the threat of Umbriel, she contacts him through Ku in the hope that he and his legendary band of warriors would help with the threat. Now, Atrebus, wanting to be the hero, immediately decides, against everyone's advice, that he will take up the challenge. Again, even though his father, the Emperor, warned against it, and the commander of his personal guard unit warned against it, he, the great hero, would no doubt be able to accomplish this, so he rode out anyway. Now, the reason that he was counseled so staunchly against it was because his entire life, unbeknownst to him, was a fabricated lie. All of his personal guard knew this, as they all knew that he was a relatively easy assignment, and most of the higher government also knew. He was only sent into battles after they were already won, or on relatively easy assignments with lots of backup. But the Emperor and High Chancellor had made him a propaganda object, presenting him as a hero to the rest of the world, and to himself, because he himself believed all this propaganda. Now, this all quite quickly comes to a head when during the trip south to face Umbriel, he and his men are ambushed by mercenaries, one of whom had secretly infiltrated his guard unit over the past few weeks, and they managed to quickly overwhelm and kill all of his guardsmen and take the prince captive. And then they nearly psychologically broke him after revealing the truth of his life, that he's actually a farce who can't really do much and who isn't much of anything, after also embarrassing him a few times in combat and just outright defeating him. Although in the end, this captivity turned out to be a pretty good thing, because you see, originally these mercenaries had been hired by the High Chancellor and Prime Minister, Hirem. Remember the conspiring guy from earlier? They had been assigned to kill Atrebus, but they figured that they could fake Atrebus' death with a different body and then sell the prince for a big price to someone outside the Empire, somewhere and elsewhere. Basically just taking money from two sides. However, that was not to be, as after quite some time of captivity and a journey into elsewhere, they are found by our fourth protagonist, Sul the Dunmer, who got a vision from Azura that in order to get revenge on Vuhon and destroy Umbriel, he had to save the prince, and Sul is kind of a beast, as he manages to defeat the entire mercenary troop all by himself and free Prince Atrebus. And as you do, he also embarrasses Atrebus quite a few times about his past and about, him being a farce in the following parts of the story, as the two of them set out together to try and find and destroy Umbriel. And in the process, Sul will teach Atrebus a thing or two about the world and actually starts to respect him a little bit more, as Atrebus himself gets more respectable by being confronted with the real world. Now at this point, the latest reports have Umbriel traveling north, towards the crater of Vivec City, where the spirit Umbra and Vuhon, the Lord Umbriel as they were fused together, want to see if they can find the sword Umbra so that it cannot be used against them, although they don't know that it's no longer there yet. So instead of immediately going to the White Gold Tower, which is their ultimate goal, they first go to the Scathing Bay where Vivec City used to be, in order to fetch the sword. So Atrebus and Sul set out to meet Umbriel head on, and in order to do so, they have a tense adventure where they first travel with a Khajiit tribe, then get involved in Rimmen's skooma trade, and then, in order to catch up to Umbriel, they try taking a shortcut through Oblivion, specifically through Hircine's realm of the Hunt, where they and the Khajiit face off against some of Hircine's creations and see the Daedric Prince himself. Not gonna lie, that part and the Rimmen part, where you get some experience of the bureaucracy of the Kingdom of Rimmen, are some of my favorite parts of the books. But while this all takes place, we get introduced to our fifth protagonist, the Penitus Oculatus Inspector Colin, who was sent to investigate the supposed death of the prince, and he finds out that someone or something tried to blame his murder on Thalmor sympathizers, while also discovering that, of course, the body is fake. This leads him to report the suspicions to the Emperor, and it sets him on a path throughout the 2 books where he investigates the death of the prince and will eventually find out Hirem's treachery and that he ordered the assassination. And he will eventually try to stop him from execute his becoming a god and supplanting the Emperor plan at the climax of the book. By the way, also during this time, Anaig and Mir Glim are still on Umbriel. Anaig is kinda doing her things with the kitchens, rising through the ranks and keeping Atribus informed of the goings on Umbriel through Ku, while Mir Glim becomes kind of a community leader among the lower classes and tries to get them better working conditions. And while they try to escape eventually, they found out that their prolonged stay on Umbriel and eating its food made it so that Anaig and Mir Glim could no longer escape and that they were bound to the city, destined to fade and die if they tried to jump off, which means that they continue to work from the inside for the foreseeable future during the books. Now, at this point, by journeying through Oblivion, Atribus and Sul reach the Scathing Bay where Vivec City used to be. Here Sul can speak to the spirit of his deceased wife, and Atribus and Sul find out that the sword Umbra is no longer there, as meanwhile the city of Umbriel approaches from the south. Now, before they can get out of Umbriel's way, they are taken up to the city by Lord Umbriel's magic, and they then face off against the Lord, the amalgamation of Vuhon and Umbra, and both Sul and Umbriel accuse one another of what happened in Vivec City, while Vuhon also reveals to Atribus that he was helped by someone from inside the Empire. Then the 3 of them fight with one another. They don't manage to defeat Umbriel, but they do manage to free themselves from his magical grasp, and then, before Umbriel can ensnare them again magically, Sul uses his own magic to grab Atribus and then bring the 2 of them into Oblivion. They then have another wacky trip through Oblivion where they meet and speak with Malakath, who helps them as the Daedric Prince of Revenge, as they were both driven by revenge against Lord Umbriel, and Malakath then sent them to Solstheim, where the Umbra sword was supposed to reside. Now, it's here when the second book starts, and it's also around this time that we are introduced to our final and 6th protagonist, Masgar Gra Yagash, an orc who is part of the Imperial Legion's scouting forces and is investigating Umbriel, as after reaching the Scathing Bay, Umbriel had made a sharp turn to the left and went straight for the Imperial City and the White Gold Tower. And by now it was becoming a real threat to the Empire, as when the city passed over a region and killed many of its inhabitants, it collected the bodies to form an undead army underneath it, meaning that there was a vast army and magical city now heading straight for the center of the Empire. Through Masgar, we get an insight into how the Imperial Legion tries to stop the city of Umbriel. You see how cities and towns get evacuated as the Flying City approaches. Hear of Legion's attempts to send soldiers up into the city and live through the part of the Imperial City under siege by the undead in the climax of the story. I'll be honest, I really like that part of the story as well, as it gives some fun insight into how the Imperial Legion works internally. And I also really like the Penitus Oculatus story of Colin, as that story gives the organization so much more depth as just the guards of the Emperor as we see them in Skyrim. I personally think that these books are worth reading just for their stories alone, and the Sul and Atribus stories are a lot of fun as well. Although again, I didn't really enjoy Anaig and Mir Glim's exploits on Umbriel that much. I mean, I like parts of the story, but some parts were just really slow, but that's just personal preference, I think. Anyway, time to get back to Atribus and Sul, as after their interaction with Malakath and subsequent transport to Solstheim, Sul and Atribus go to the castle of a minor Dunmer house on Solstheim, and there, after some quarrels with the house, they manage to obtain the sword from its previous holder, the Lord's son, who had been driven mad and undead by the sword, killing him to take the sword from him. They then use the sword's connection to Clavicus Vile to warp back into Clavicus Vile's realm, and there they speak with Clavicus Vile himself, who explains to them that they need to stab Umbra the spirit with Umbra the sword, so that Clavicus Vile can bring the city back into his realm and Umbra back under his control. They bargained with Clavicus Vile then, who after some convincing, after first wanting to take their souls, was willing to send them to a shrine near the Imperial City, as if Umbriel wasn't stopped from reaching the White Gold Tower, he may never get Umbra or Umbriel back, so it wouldn't be worth it to take the souls from Sul and Atribus now, even though he really wants their souls. Now, at that point they are teleported by Clavicus Vile to the Imperial City, but lo and behold, they are betrayed again, as some men who tried helping them get to the city turned out to work for Hirem, and thus they were taken prisoner and locked away in Hirem's personal quarters so that the Emperor wouldn't find them, and he interrogates them about their involvement in his plans. Now, after learning from them that Lord Umbriel fears the Umbra sword, Hirem is temporarily satisfied and he uses a portal in his office to teleport to Umbriel to continue the negotiations with its lord. Meanwhile, the Penitus Oculatus agent Colin, along with another agent, Lutine Aris, discovers that Atribus is being held captive by the High Chancellor, so they set out to enter Hirem's quarters and then they free Atribus and Sul. It's then decided that Atribus and Sul will attempt to use Hirem's portal when it opens up upon his return to go up to Umbriel with the sword Umbra and stab its lord with the sword, while Colin and Lutine would await the High Chancellor's return in order to arrest or kill him. And that plan, at least initially, works like clockwork. When Hirem comes back from his meeting with Lord Umbriel, Sul and Atribus use the portal to ascend up to Umbriel, which is now extremely close to the Imperial city, while Colin and Lutine fight Hirem, and after some struggle he is killed by Lutine's summoned creatures. Meanwhile, Atribus and Sul, having entered Lord Umbriel's domain, fight the Lord once more, but this time they manage to stab him with the Umbra sword. Good ending. Everyone happy. Cool. But no, it turns out that after Hirem was defeated, the other Penitus Oculatus agent, Lutine, who over the course of the story we learn has been spying on Hirem for the Emperor for over 10 years, stabs Colin with a knife after they kill Hirem, and she takes Hirem's gear, aiming to take his place in the ritual to become a god, confident that she can cast the ritual herself, and feeling like she deserved it to get something back after 10 years of a thankless job for the Emperor. But fortunately she fails and is killed by Colin, although Colin himself also dies pretty quickly after that from his wounds. So no real good ending for the Penitus Oculatus story. Meanwhile, Lord Umbriel, while weakened by the stab, is in no way completely defeated from the stab with Umbra, because remember, his soul and the fused soul of Umbra and Vuhon was no longer in his body, but it was inside the second Ingenium, so that they could control everything in Umbriel, while the body they fought no longer has a soul, so the sword, while having some effect, has relatively little effect. But it turns out that Lord Umbriel was severely weakened, as in the background of all this, Anaik had used her alchemical skills to poison this sort of histories on the island, which facilitated a lot of Lord Umbriel's control and power over the city. This severely weakened Lord Umbriel, but it also put many of the inhabitants of the city in danger. This is actually where the story of Anaig and Mirglim comes to a head, as while Anaig wants to take the city down, Mirglim, having spoken to the pseudo-histories on the city, knows that they only want to go home and be rid of Lord Umbriel, and as such, Anaig is convinced to spare the city and gives Mirglim the antidote to the poison, using his connection to the histories, which is extra strong due to his soul over the course of the story being reborn in Umbriel through the Ingenium. Mirglim then cures the poisoned trees and uses his connection with them to instruct them to direct the city back into oblivion and away from the Imperial city. But Lord Umbriel is not dead yet, and he uses his connection to the city and the trees to block out Mirglim. That is, until Atribus takes the sword Umbra and stabs the new Ingenium with it, destroying Lord Umbriel and the independence of the Umbra spirit, leaving only Vuhon behind. Clavicus Vile then attempts to claim Atribus' soul, but it fails when Sul intervenes and sacrifices his own soul to Clavicus Vile, falling into the Ingenium so that Atribus may live. With both Umbra and Sul gone, Vuhon now completely is himself again. He's not really a nice guy, but he's also no longer influenced by the Umbra spirit, which apparently really corrupted him. And he warns that it won't be long until Clavicus Vile, in his twisted mind, will let Umbriel fall into the Imperial city once he gains control back over Umbriel. So Vuhon tells Mirglim, who is now in control of the city, to quickly get them out of the mortal plane and out of Clavicus Vile's grasp. Mirglim complies with this after a heartfelt goodbye with Anaig, who together with Prince Atribus will descend back to Tamriel, as Mirglim, using his new power over the city, manages to sever their connection to the city, making them leave safely, while Mirglim and Vuhon, who Atribus decided to spare, stay on the city, which is then promptly taken out of the Mundus, or the mortal plane, by the Umbriel Hist and Mirglim, who bring them into a strange realm called the Realm of the Hist, where he and the inhabitants of Umbriel can live away from Clavicus Vile. The story basically ends there with a bit of closure, where the Emperor Titus Mede witnesses how his son has gone through a lot of personal character growth, as for the first time he returned from an adventure as an actual hero instead of as a farce. And while the Emperor wants to celebrate his victory, Atribus tells him not to give him the credit, but instead just give the credit to the Synod and College of Whispers, the two magical institutions of the Empire which tried to defend the city. He reckons that he's had enough glory which had been undeserved, and that this glory, which was deserved, served could be better used for political gains to stabilize the empire after such a crisis, so he declined the credit for his real heroic deed. And Titus Mead is then proud of the man that his son has become, and Atrebus, after communicating throughout the book a lot with Anaik through the cool video call thingy, which over the story kinda had them fall in love, begins a relationship with her, leading to most people in the community assuming that she became the Emperor's consort after he ascended to the throne after his father's death, but we don't really know about that. Okay, that was a pretty long recount, and even then I missed a lot in order to keep the video going and to not interfere in the overall plot too much. I mean, Masgar has this whole plot of following Umbriel's devastation across Cyrodiil and an emotional end with her fellow soldier who dies defending the Imperial city against the undead. Colin has this whole romantic side plot with Latine, which I completely skipped over. Mir Glim also has a romantic side plot with one of the Umbriel inhabitants, and he is killed during the story, which is why he was reborn through the Ingenium and has this strong connection. And I had to skip over the whole kitchen plotline, which in my opinion wasn't the most interesting story in the books, and it really slowed the books down, as in it just was a distractor sometimes. I mean, it served its purpose, but it could have been far shorter. What I'm trying to say is these books, they aren't perfect, but they give you a lot of Elder Scrolls, and I do say that they do feel like Elder Scrolls, even if they have some draggy sections. Now, this was me mostly going over the main plot, but even then, like I said, I kinda had to skip over a ton of side beats to keep the pace of the video going, and perhaps I may have skipped over a bit too many of them, so sorry if you were a big fan of any of the areas I skipped, like the romantic subplot between Colin and Latine, but I tried to keep it as plot relevant as possible, as the books can be a little bit out there sometimes. But still, the fact that these books just exist is amazing, and I wish so badly that Bethesda gave us more like this. Just books and character-driven stories in the Elder Scrolls universe. Oh, I want it so much. But even then, these books are a little gem and a door back to the past, as the past that is 2009 and September 2011. Back to when Skyrim hadn't even launched, and it introduced us to so many concepts like the Thalmor, the Penatus Oculatus, the Ancellil, the destruction of Morrowind, the Argonian invasion, and even light foreshadows the Great War. If you read the books in that context, these are amazing bridge books between Oblivion and Skyrim, and I hope that we get more of these, perhaps as bridges between Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls 6. Who knows, one can dream. I just hope for more books. It's amazing to even have them. Even though the books themselves aren't that good, it just has so much potential. But still, I think they are a very interesting read for any Elder Scrolls fan. But hey, that's about all I can say about the Elder Scrolls novels. Definitely fun to have a reread of them over this summer, and to give the story to you guys. And I sincerely hope that you had fun listening to the video, and that you learned something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if you did, why not give the video a like, as that's how the YouTube algorithm decides what content is worthy and what content is not. Or give it a boost, that's apparently a thing now. Would be very appreciated. And with that said, it's time to thank my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, King Chris 20, Steve G, Volker of Argonia, RB Dash, His Soul, Lexicon, Ranger, Komodo, Rakai, and Sorta Bushido. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen, so my YouTube members and my Patreon subscribers, that this channel stays afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next lore video. Bye bye.